Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another Thursday morning live stream. We're thrilled you've joined us once again. I'm Sandy Campbell, the Executive Director of the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. And of course, today we're going back into the world of journalism and looking at the many different things happening in journalism today from a local issue. We're going to stick with the journalism theme, as you all know we love to do. And next week on March 4th, we're going to be interviewing the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News, John Micklethwait, and Adrian Wooldridge, who is a writer for The Economist, and they're going to be talking about their new book called The Wake Up Call, looking at how the pandemic has exposed some issues here in the West. So that should be a good one to join in for. And then the following Thursday, on March 11th, we are going to feature Steve Herman, who is the White House Bureau Chief for the Voice of America. And as we all know, the Voice of America went through some pretty serious challenges during the Trump administration. And Steve was the bureau chief during those 4 years and participated in all kinds of things in the White House press pool. And of course, a lot of the pressures put on VOA during the administration. So lots of interesting talks coming up. Of course, we launched our Russia Disruption series yesterday and had an extraordinary conversation with three amazing experts on Russia. On March 18th, which is 3 Thursdays from now, we have a fantastic professor from San Francisco State University who's going to be talking all about the changes and so on that have happened and will continue to happen in US-Russia relations. So lots of goodies coming up. We look forward to joining you for them all. And that is pretty much everything I have to say. So let me bring in today's speakers and I'll introduce them quickly and then we can get into what I'm sure will be a great conversation. So first of all, we have joining us 3 speakers. I'm going to introduce them in turn. And first up is Karen. Good morning, Karen Coates. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Karen, of course, presented a film at Journalism Under Fire in 2018 with her husband, Jerry Redfern, which was a spectacular look at lots of interesting things going on in Southeast Asia. And Karen is an independent journalist who covers food, environment, health, and human rights globally. She's an International Women's Media Foundation Fellow, contributing editor to Archaeology magazine, a James Beard nominee in investigative reporting, and a former TED Scripps Fellow in environmental journalism. And super interestingly, she led the first group of Burmese journalists to cover the United Nations and G20 Summit for their local publications. In 2009, she was arrested and deported from Myanmar while teaching journalism through a US State Department program in democracy, which I hope we hear more about today. So anyway, moving on, we then have Jessica Onsurez. Welcome, Jessica. It's good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
So Jessica is the news director of the Carlsbad Current Argus, the Alamogordo Daily News, and Ruidoso News, which are all members of the USA Today network in New Mexico. She's an award-winning journalist, photographer, and editor with a decade of journalism under her belt. A native daughter of New Mexico, her work has carried her from the US Senate in Washington, D.C. to Peru with the US Peace Corps. So we're thrilled to have you here. Today's moderator is Rashad Mahmood. Welcome, Rashad.
Thank you.
Rashad is the co-director of the New Mexico Local News Fund and the 2021 John S. Knight Community Impact Fellow. He's worked in New Mexico journalism for 7 years and previously worked in international development in Washington, D.C., Egypt, and Iraq. So welcome you all. As always, folks out there, put your questions into the Q&A bar, or Q&A panel rather, and we'll get to them in about 40 minutes or so. And I look forward to a great conversation. And Rashad, let me turn it all over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Sandy. And thank you everyone out there for tuning in today. So what I really wanted to focus the discussion on today is essentially we're in a paradox of news right now. From a consumer perspective, it's essentially the golden age of news. Just at the click of a button, you can read about anything going on in our national politics in other countries. But at the same time, the local news organizations that do the hard work of reporting on local government, of reporting on communities, on local businesses, is struggling and failing. Here in New Mexico, there are 4 whole counties that don't have a single source of local news. We've lost 13 newspapers in New Mexico just since 2004. Actually, I think that might be up to 14 with the closure of the Los Alamos Monitor last year. and 22 counties only have one source of local news here in New Mexico. And so I wanted to talk to Karen and Jessica today about the challenge that local news faces both here and abroad, and a little bit about how we can sustain it moving forward. How can we innovate and ensure that local news is available for generations to come? Because without it, democracy really is worse without access to that crucial local information. So Karen, I know you've reported extensively on the current situation in Myanmar, and because it's such an important crisis going on right now with the recent military coup. Can you just talk a little bit about the challenges and dangers that local journalists face there, and a bit about how do people get access to local information about what's going on there and in other parts of Southeast Asia that you've reported on?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so the situation in Myanmar right now is just horrible. I mean, there's no other way to describe it, and especially for the journalists working on the ground. And when we're talking about the journalists there, we're talking about local news reporters who are out there every day on the streets covering what's happening. In the last week or so, journalists have all pretty much gone into hiding. They're not going home at night. They're not going to their offices. They're moving from place to place, working in secrecy. They are trying to get around these shutdowns of the internet that the military has imposed at random hours. So they're going through international networks to do that. And there's one of the great things that I'm really inspired by is this strong network of journalists around the world who are working to help them and get money from point A to point B to keep them working and keep them on the job, because the journalists I know there all want to stay. Some of them have fled to neighboring Thailand, and they're starting up newsrooms outside of the country, which is what has happened in the past. That's how local news was done under the previous military regime, and that's going to happen again. But right now, there is a desperate need to fund the journalists who are there working on the ground. And also, because of COVID, a lot of these reporters had not been paid regularly throughout the last year. So they're working without any money and risking their lives every day to do it.
And but is moving to Thailand really going to be that helpful, right? I mean, I know the situation for local journalism in other parts of Southeast Asia is also just really challenging, right?
It is. I mean, Thailand is under its own military authority, and freedom of the press there has not really existed in the last several years. But the journalists in Myanmar have a history of working through Thailand and other countries, and they have their own deeply rooted network. So it is possible to get it done, but obviously, that the restrictions in Thailand and the restrictions throughout the region are going to have a huge effect on the information coming out.
And one more follow-up before we move on. So Karen, how is that impacting people's flip it around for the average person in Myanmar or in Thailand? How is that situation impacting their ability to just know what's going on in terms of the government and in terms of what's happening with the coup and Aung San Suu Kyi and things like that?
Well, tensions are extremely high right now. And so people are looking for the truth in what's happening. And because of the chaos, it's more and more difficult for fact checking and because of social media and the instantaneous reveal of information through things like Twitter, you can't always be sure what is accurate, but people are just desperate to keep whatever information is possible to keep it flowing.
Cool. Jessica, I wanted to ask you, obviously the situation in the United States and rural areas is very different. But at the same time, we've increasingly seen, lower and lower budgets for newsrooms covering rural parts of the state of the United States and here in New Mexico. Can you talk a little more about your reporting in New Mexico and how things have been changing, and just how has this impacted the local communities that you report on?
Well, I think the place to start is with the statistics that you gave earlier, which are, if you think about the 33 counties that are in New Mexico, which has a huge rural population, 22 of those only have one source of local news. And when you really dive into those sources of local news, you're talking about newsrooms that are only employing maybe one or two, at the most three local journalists. So you're really talking about this, a desert. We can devote only so much time and only so much effort into covering everything that a local community needs. And we, at the editorial level, at the management level, are talking about priorities, right? We are sacrificing really important coverage to be able to do other really important coverage that our communities need at that moment. And that is, you can draw a direct line from that into finances. And that's because of a lot of different things. We were talking about investments into our local newsrooms from those owners of those newsrooms. A lot of our New Mexico newsrooms, not so many of them anymore, are independently owned. A lot of them belong to larger companies, larger corporations like the ones that I manage. And then you're also able to draw a parallel into the trust that the communities place into those newsrooms, and how when that trust goes up and down, just dependent upon what's happening within our nation, some of that support is withdrawn. And so you're really talking about a cut in funding there. So it's a wide scope of things that are impacting every journalist's ability to be able to cover their newsroom.
Jessica, can you talk a little more about, you talked about trust, right? And from the data I've seen, in general, when you ask people, what do you think of your local newspaper or your local radio station, people generally have a pretty positive view of their local news organizations. But if you ask them about the media more generally, or you ask them about national media, people often seem to have much lower favorability ratings. I'm just curious, how have you seen the last 4 years and, very politicization of attacks on news? How has that impacted your relationships with your community and New Mexicans in general?
Well, so the root of trust for our community is our actual presence here. People know us. We live here. We work here every day. We knock on their doors. We call their phones. They know our names. They know the families that we come from. So that lends a lot to the trust that our reporters get on the ground here. So when we cover local events, local issues of import, they tend, to that same point, they tend to trust the information that's coming from our newsrooms and from our journalists as being accurate, well-researched, and to the point, and impactful for them. But it's interesting, especially for our newsrooms, because we are corporately owned by Gannett Network, which owns the USA Today brand, and people here realize that as well. And our situation is unique in Southeast New Mexico in my newsrooms, because we are in a conservative part of the state versus the rest of New Mexico, where there's already a large conflict when it comes to political views. And especially over the last few years, what we have seen is that the community is willing to trust us when it comes to, our readers are willing to trust us when it comes to stories that are very locally focused. But because part of our mandate is to share larger reporting from the USA Today network, from our fellow newsrooms here in New Mexico, and even Texas, Oklahoma, other areas that we share interest with. That's where the distrust comes in. They do exactly as you say. They tend to look at that reporting, that information, a little bit more skeptically. They tend to ask more questions about what motivates it, and then they tend to assign that motivation to politics. But and that's part of our job, is to just remind them that every journalist comes to a story with the intention of informing, and not with the intention of biasing somebody one way or another.
So one issue I'm curious about is how coverage plays out. is obviously, issues around the environment and natural resources in Southeast New Mexico are, of critical importance for your communities and for the state as a whole. And I'm just curious, can you talk a little more about how you cover those, how both the local government level, like how those decisions are made locally, and how you cover the more of the statewide impact and what the community reaction is to those?
So you're right. We're a bastion of the oil and gas industry here in Southeast New Mexico. We're in the heart of the Permian and Delaware basins, where, we've been called the biggest potential extraction field in the world. And we understand that means that we are feeding state revenues, local revenues all across the board. But I think that you'll also find, because of that political disparity there, we're a conservative area. We tend to look upon those industries with favor. We also tend to look upon the criticisms that are coming from outside of our region about those industries and their impact on environmental issues unfavorably. So when we approach that type of reporting, we always do it with a local eye of being able to say, here is where our local leaders stand. Here is where, the workers in this industry might be impacted. We pull those sources into that reporting, but because we also understand that it's our job to make sure that our readers are getting both sides of the stories, both sides of the concerns. We do a lot of environmental reporting as well, and we rely a lot on data and facts that we pull from those sources to do that. So we tend to keep it as balanced as possible. And that, readers, depending upon where they're coming from, will receive that also with a bit of dismay. They tend to see environmentalist groups who are coming to the region to promote this idea of less oil and gas, more environmental protections as, outside their community or outsiders and not really reflective of their view, their perspective. But I think one of the other things that we have found is that as part of our network, our New Mexico network, we share reporting from other sites. So they're getting that additional perspective from outside their community as well. If they choose to consume it, it's there for them. And responses to that reporting are varied. Some people thank us. Some people are saying, hey, we weren't aware that this is an actual issue outside of our community. But I think they're also really concerned in making sure that the reporting that we're doing at a local level is reaching that regional, state, and national level so that others outside of the community understand where they're coming from.
Thanks, Jessica. So one consequence of a lack of local news is that, we've seen in some parts of New Mexico, these really outlandish stories of corruption, where you've had like sheriffs abusing their power. We've had city like comptrollers, like abusing finances and stuff like that. Can you just talk a little bit about how, in your reporting, you work to try to make sure that doesn't happen, essentially?
So it's about prioritization, right? The 3 reporters that I have on staff now between my 3 sites, we talk about this on a daily basis. What's happening, make sure you're keeping an eye on your local government, whether that's your county, your city, or your school boards, because money, public monies flow through there too. We really, it's a juggling game. We tend to focus on those items when they come up on our daily schedule. And then one of the other things that we've started doing now to try to kind of combat that, laissez-faire from our regional governments is actually keeping an eye on the happenings in the communities around us. So we're not just focusing on Carlsbad, Alamogordo, and Ruidoso. We're focusing on our outlying cities and municipalities and our neighboring. As you said, one local source of news in a county can only do so much. So we're lending a hand, and we're focusing also on what's happening in our neighboring counties in that same way. But also a lot of that depends upon the level and skill and experience that your reporter has. I think there's a lot of new reporters coming into communities that they're not familiar with. They don't have any of that experience with. And so some of that can slip by, and it's a real problem. the only way that we can combat it is to be really proactive about talking about what is happening there and making sure that any issue that does pop up, we're on top of.
Karen, in a similar vein, can you talk a little bit about sort of how local news can contribute to holding people in power accountable in more authoritarian governments, like in some of the places you've worked? Like, for example, so when I lived in Egypt, I worked at an English language paper, and the regime there generally had a pretty laissez-faire attitude to the English language media, because there was a perception that, you know, it wouldn't change or impact the views of the majority of people who are Arabic speakers. But Arabic media was very controlled, very censored. And today, you know, I haven't lived there since 2013, but from friends that are familiar with Egypt, I know that today, even the few independent Arabic papers that were there have been even more forcefully controlled. So I'm just curious, Karen, can you talk a little bit about sort of that interplay between local news and authoritarianism and how that works out?
Sure, absolutely. And you know, okay, if you get back to Myanmar and look at what's happening there right now, this is a movement that is about local news. And I would say, I would broaden that to say local information that is getting out to the rest of the world. And, you know, I think by focusing on the term local news, we're getting away from
Sure.
talk of platforms, because the platforms are changing as technology does and as the needs do. So the information, the local information that is coming out of a place like Myanmar right now is what could, if anything is going to stop this coup or turn things around, it will be because of that information. That is the key difference to looking at the past and what happened in Myanmar when there was no social media, there was no opportunity like there is today for local reporters to reach the rest of the world. And that's an incredibly powerful thing to have that ability to communicate across borders and across the world. Um, and you know, it's similar in all of the countries I've worked in. And I want to make another point too, that I think here in the US, we tend to create a division between local and national news or local and global news. I don't see that so much in the places where I've worked in other countries. News is news. And in many, many cases, you know, what happens in our local community, what happens in my village here in New Mexico, is directly tied to the things that happen nationally and globally, whether we're talking about drought, climate change, or even, you know, the situation in Myanmar. So some of the same companies that provide something like 40% of New Mexico's budget, oil and gas, they have a foothold in Myanmar, and they are pushing to not have sanctions on oil and gas. So the way things unfold in Myanmar will have a direct and indirect effect on the New Mexico economy. And I think there are so many ways that in the overall picture of talking about strengthening democracy, whether it's here in New Mexico or in Myanmar or Cambodia or Egypt, there are things that we as journalists as a whole can do to create better connections around what happens in our own neighborhood and how that relates to what happens on a global scale.
Thanks, Karen. That's a really great point. One question I have is, obviously I'm the New Mexico Local News Fund, we're a big believer in the power and importance of access to local news and information. But I want to acknowledge that, you know, journalists aren't perfect, and the media industry over time has had structural issues similar to lots of, to like other aspects of society here in the United States. For too long, communities of color, low-income communities were basically marginalized or ignored, or reported on only, when there was like crime or like almost like poverty porn reporting, I'm sure many people are familiar with. How do we make journalism better? How do we ensure that that's that's in the past, and that the local news and reporting that we're doing today is inclusive and includes all New Mexicans. Jessica?
We are in a state where there is a huge disparity between what our newsrooms look like and how they reflect the communities that we cover. And I think everybody recognizes that. And so the first step is actually to make sure that we are populating our newsrooms, that we are bringing in journalists who are able to reflect the communities that they are working in, the voices there, and who not only reflect them, but understand them and can lend perspective to them. That's the first place to start, I think. I can say in our newsrooms, for example, I am the only person of color. I am the only person who speaks a secondary language. And so, we're talking about newsrooms that cover 3 of our huge counties in Southeast New Mexico, and there's only one person on staff who speaks an alternate language, right? So that's the first step, but also, it's difficult to do that. It's difficult to create an equality of coverage when we are in a position where we only have a few staff covering that area, where there's not enough funding to actually dive into that type of reporting. But I think that there are big steps that we can take, and we've been doing this on a small scale, and we've seen some really great results, which is, initiating conversations, doing things like surveying that community. What type of news do you want to see? What issues are of most import to you? How do you get your information? How do you get your news? Are you coming to us? Are you finding alternative measures to do that? So that has given us some insight into being able to make a plan to cover these communities. And then the second part of that is trust as well. You can't build trust among those communities unless you're there, you're talking to them, you're explaining your processes, you're explaining what it is that you're trying to achieve, and being very upfront about where you are and in this whole process and trying to improve it. We do know, for example, in Carlsbad, we have got the oil and gas industry, as mentioned before, and we know that a lot of the workers in that industry coming in are from populations that we've never seen in this region before. So we are trying to identify them as well. And that's always a challenge. There's a lot of transient communities moving throughout our region here that we just don't ever have contact with. So really making that a priority in how we go about doing our reporting. And the other portion of that is that we're talking about huge focuses, these projects that we're devoting time and effort and funding into covering those topics that we noted that were of interest. So those communities we're hoping to make connections with, but I think it's also important to keep our ears and our eyes open about how they're shifting in local regions that we're covering.
Great, thanks so much, Jessica. Karen, I'm curious what you think in terms of internationally. Are there similar challenges around, like, communities that have been excluded from the narrative? I mean, I'm sure there are, but just can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, going back to Myanmar, we're talking about a country that has 135 officially recognized ethnic groups. And that's not counting the ones like the Rohingya, which, we have all heard the horror stories about what happened there. So there are huge discrepancies in the ways that different communities are covered. And, it's something that's coming out of Myanmar right now, how many of the youth in this movement for democracy are recognizing that, their country did not, and journalists did not always cover ethnic groups properly. They did not give them the voices or, listen to the people as should happen. And they're calling for a future without like a single hero as a leader. They're calling for, greater information about everybody as a whole society. Yeah, and that's true in so many of the places where I've worked. Another thing that I have seen, and this is true when I'm reporting here in the US on international issues, that when seeking out sources, especially in science writing communities, I find that, it's incredibly difficult for people to recognize scientists as sources from Africa, from Latin America, from across Asia, to get reporters to value the same, peer-reviewed studies coming out of other regions of the world, and give those studies and give those sources and scientists the same weight and value as we do, Western traditions.
That's a great point, Karen. Thanks so much for that. I can just speak to my experience. I worked at KUNM Radio in Albuquerque for a number of years, and part of my job was to do some of that community outreach and understand what's going on in different communities around Albuquerque. And, there was a real sense of grievance, I think, in some communities, like especially the international district. If you talk to them about journalism and media, there was an overwhelming sense that media was a negative force in their lives, right? That it was focused on just talking about all the bad things going on in their neighborhood. The only articles about the international district were about when there was a murder or when there was some sort of crime or something like that. And I think, that cuts both ways, right? Because when people feel excluded, then they no longer trust the media to begin with, right? They don't, and then it also damages the sense of cohesion within a community because there's a lack of awareness of what's going on and things like that. And so it's sort of it builds upon itself, right? So I think it's really crucial. And that's one of the things that we strive for at the local news fund, is trying to sort of repair those connections and rebuild people's relationship with media. And I think, Jessica, to your point, one of our programs is we have an early career fellowship for recent graduates from the University of New Mexico and New Mexico State University that want to stay in journalism here. Because one of the things we heard was that young journalists often have to leave New Mexico for their first journalism jobs, right? They have to go to like Arizona or Texas or Colorado because there are just so few entry-level jobs here. And so, we really believe that one solution is if we can get them started in journalism here in New Mexico, where they're from, where they already know the community, then hopefully they can stay and contribute. I want to just go back to the national issue a little bit here in the United States. During the Trump administration, obviously the label of like fake news was a really prominent issue. Have you guys, I guess more Jessica, have you seen, I know it's just been a few weeks really, but have you seen anything start to change in terms of how you've been interacting with community members just over the last weeks, months since the election? Or do you think this is going to be like a permanent part of our discourse?
I do believe that it's going to be a permanent part of our discourse, and I do believe it's going to be a permanent way in which we are viewed from here forward. I think that seed has already been planted. I can say that not much has changed. I think it's a little early in the game, but we have been since 2019, early 2019, really focused on communicating our objectives, our goals, how we do local journalism to try to combat that mistrust. But overall, when it comes to local news, I think that we are as much an easy target as national news for these labels. I've experienced many different phone calls, emails, just interactions where we do get labeled fake news, or we get accused of cancel culture, or whatever it might be. And all of this does come from the national discourse. And a lot of it does stem from that rhetoric that was coming from DC and our administration. But I think that it's entrenched now. I think that we are always going to be looked at with that bit of those colored glasses, of course, the products that we produce, the reporting that we do, or even our intentions as journalists, our ethics and our standards will always be shaded by that from here on out. If I could add anything to this conversation about that particular question, it would be that it takes every journalist every day making a connection to really kind of help start erasing that perspective.
So Jessica, let's say I was a local community member in one of your communities that you report on, and I, just loved local journalism and I recognize the importance of it. What can I do to be a more engaged sort of news consumer and, and just sort of strengthen and support local news in New Mexico?
Subscribe. So that's actually a really great question. What we tell our local community members is that there is nothing more supportive of local journalism as a subscription to your local newsroom, number one. But also there are so many ways to educate readers about what good journalism is, what accurate and reliable sources of journalism is. We do local courses where we talk about, making sure where you're getting your news from is a reliable news source, double checking what you're reading and being careful about spreading rumors or unfact checked items on your social media through your networks that way. But also, I think that part of what our readership has really done to undertake some support of our local newsrooms is to become better communicators with us. We rely on them as much as they rely on us, and it is through our readers that we, get tips about what's happening in our community. We identify the important aspects, the things that we should be prioritizing. So, if you want to be a good consumer of local news, a good supporter of local news, open a dialogue with your local journalists. Start there.
Great, thanks, Jessica. And Karen, sort of same question. What do you think people in New Mexico can do to sort of strengthen their relationship with local news and become more of a participant in the local news ecosystem?
Well, I think a lot of it should start with journalists. I think, and I've said this so many times in so many places, that I think we often don't do a good job of explaining how we work. Just, the whole process of how do we actually report stories, how are those stories edited, fact checking, to convey to the public that yes, there is a reason to trust us, that it's not, what you're reading or what you're seeing from a journalist is not the same thing as what you're finding on Facebook or Nextdoor or rumors in your neighborhood or whatever, because we go through these standard procedures to verify information. And I think that, on a lot of levels, people aren't always even clear on different parts of a newspaper. I, hear constantly throughout my whole career, people referring to op-eds as articles. And there's a huge difference there. And I think we need to do a much better job of explaining, just what it is that we do, and then open ourselves up to questions from the people around us.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, please go ahead, Jessica.
So that's a great point, Karen. And I think that one of the things that it does is it adds value to the reporting when we can explain how we do it, but why the information we're giving you is so much more than just what comes in, say, a press release or a posting to Facebook. It adds value to the reporting that we're doing, and it adds depth for our readers.
Mm-hmm. Well, that seems like a perfect segue, since I'm seeing a bunch of interesting questions come in. Sandy, are we ready to take some audience questions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would love to start with a question that Karen, you typed an answer to. Obviously we have a challenge for journalism in Myanmar right now, and there's lots of different examples that I've read of journalists doing their best to get information out to their public and out to us as well. And so Diana Baker asks, what's the most effective way for us to support journalists in Myanmar, whether financially or via other means?
So right now, the greatest need, I think, from anybody who's not right there is going to be financial, because that's the way that those funds can get funneled to the direct needs of journalists, whether we're talking about gas masks and helmets or SIM cards for their phone, or even PTSD counseling, that sort of thing. I put a link to a fundraiser that has it was started by a group of international journalists that is working directly to get money and help to journalists throughout Myanmar. And there are other organizations also working on different pieces of this. This all started as a grassroots effort, and it's coming together pretty well. But the big thing is that we all recognize down the road, this is going to require a major funding campaign from someone with a lot of money. Because if you just consider, for example, every journalist every few days has to top up their phone card, and just to keep working and stay connected. So $10 every few days, and you multiply that by the number of journalists in the country, and you're talking about, $7,000, $10,000 a week just to keep people working. And that's not talking about getting them paid or keeping them safe. So I would love to see some large organization step up and say, look, this, what is happening there is important for the world and for democracies around the world. So we want to help this effort of what the local journalists are doing there right now.
That's great. Let's stay with the topic of money for a second, and let's hop over to Australia, where we're seeing how Facebook and Google are essentially being challenged by the state of Australia, saying you two are the culprits for a serious decline in revenue for local journalism, and therefore we are going to work on a law that blocks stories from whoever appearing on Facebook. And Jessica, maybe I'll throw this one to you first. Do you think that better regulation of social media, particularly when it comes to news feeds, would be somewhat of a tonic for some of the, the financial ills that ail the local journalism market?
Look, we know that readers go in search of what they want to read, whether that means that they're going to social media, some other pseudo news site, or to their local journalists. But I think that on that particular topic, we have always tended to look at these platforms as partners in disseminating information. So being, restricting them in any way, we get into really some muddy water there. When it comes to a tonic for revenue, I think that perhaps I'd like to see what happens in Australia. And I understand the motivation is if you can't get these tidbits on a social media platform, you're going to be forced to go to your local media. But that's not a game that we want to play. We want our readers, any reader, to be able to see value in local journalism, regardless of where they're getting it from. So it's a very kind of slippery slope there. When you start talking about government putting its hands into what is essentially, we view it as the fourth estate, right? An independent industry, which should stand independent of any government interference, then the bigger questions arise. We're all for any strategic model that helps us increase revenues to local medias, to journalists, but I think that it takes a wider conversation, which includes the media industry, to really come to a decision on that.
Well, and maybe that begs the question too of looking at organizational models for journalism. And there's a question here about, there is a trend towards nonprofit journalist entities. We of course have Searchlight New Mexico, based in Santa Fe, which is a nonprofit. Karen, what are your thoughts about this movement? Is the movement towards a nonprofit sector for journalism a good thing, a small thing that will become a big thing? Or, there's pros and cons to every organizational model, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think it can be an answer. I don't think, this is the problem here. I don't think there's any one answer to fixing this overwhelming problem of news and journalism today. Certainly in my own, personal life, nonprofit journalism and groups that fund nonprofit journalism have been huge and instrumental through grants and organizations that actually fund the work of reporting as opposed to publishing. So I think that there's a big differentiation between what it costs for especially independent journalists like myself to actually go out and do the reporting, and that more and more is being supported by nonprofit groups, and then the publication of that work which is never enough to, it's barely enough to cover just like living costs, but most often not enough to cover the expense of the reporting itself. That, that might happen at a for-profit level. I think, again, there's no one simple fix to this. I think there are ways that nonprofits and for-profits can work together to support the journalism as an industry, a business, because it has to be. I mean, we're all working in it. We all have to make our own livelihood. So it is a business. But also as something much more beyond that, is like a foundation to our society and democracy.
Great. Well, and I guess continuing along those lines, we talked a little bit earlier in the conversation about the issue of consolidation, and Gannett, of course, is one example. Another example, as in the Q&A, is Sinclair Broadcasting, which is not only about consolidation, but also about advancement of a certain political ideology. So, and Jessica, maybe I'll ask you this one. Does, an entity like Sinclair Broadcasting make things more difficult for local newspapers? Does it affect the way local papers cover news? Or is Sinclair relatively marginal simply because the internet offers so many amazing, perspectives these days?
I think, yes, anytime you're talking about consolidation of local newsrooms under an umbrella, you're going to see a trickle down effect. One of the things that appealed to me about working for the Current Argus, the Alamogordo Daily News, the Ruidoso News under the Gannett umbrella is that they look at us as still local newsrooms. So we're given autonomy when it comes to covering those necessary items in our regions that fall under our reporting beats. But when you talk about pulling these networks together to advance political agendas, whatever it might be, there's a real threat to how journalists do their jobs every day, and there's a real threat to the standards and the ethics that we hold as journalists as we go about reporting.
Yeah, it's such a huge issue. Karen, do you want to chime in on any of those issues in terms of consolidation, political ideology?
I think Jess did a good job.
Great. Let's move to our next question. And this is from Mike Marcotte. Hey, Mike, professor down at UNM School of Communications and Journalism. And this is a meaty question, so maybe we need to break it down a little bit. But he asks, if local connections breed greater trust, as Jessica indicated, but local news is shrinking and has a small revenue base, as Rashad indicated, how might this local trust be translated into more local revenue? So there's more to the question, but maybe that's a good question to kind of dig into first. And Jessica, you're nodding your head, so why don't you share your thoughts on that?
So this is the one that we struggle with every day. We are talking about translating trust into revenue, which we haven't figured out. We had that model down back before the internet, but not so much now. We every day we talk to people. Every conversation I have is to remind people that journalism is an industry. We're a business. We're in it to make money, and that's the way it is. We've also shifted a lot of our focus from reminding people that advertising is no longer a way to support a newsroom, that we're really relying on our readers and subscriptions to do that. And that again returns to it's a flowing conversation. We talk about, hey, the more you support us, the more that we're able to dive into those issues that are important to you, the more that we're able to go hire new bodies to be able to cover more expansive topics within your community. So it's all about education for the most part. We haven't had much success that I've seen in our company and in other companies in New Mexico journalism generally, in being able to make that translation from trust to revenue. So it's still, those are still models that we're working on. And I think anybody who comes up with one that works really well is going to be a millionaire at some point. But it's hard to continually increase that trust and see it translate to that. I will say that.
Sandy, if I can jump in a little bit, I think, this is sort of the question that the New Mexico Local News Fund was essentially founded to tackle, right? And I think across the country, we're increasingly seeing the rise of sort of like these bridge organizations a little bit, similar to the local news fund, that, we're platform agnostic, right? We support everyone getting access to the local news and information they need. And so if we can help direct grant money to reporting, we don't care if it goes to support a for-profit organization, like Jessica works with, or the nonprofit organizations filling in gaps that other media aren't tackling. And I would say that I think there is an increased interest from philanthropists to support local news, at least in the United States, and I think internationally is my impression as well, because people really are starting to realize that that the traditional revenue models just aren't sufficient, right? And so while I do think that it's incumbent on news organizations to innovate themselves and do experiment and try to bring in as much revenue through alternative sources like events or other online services or partnerships or things like that, I do think there's an important role for philanthropy to support local journalism. And there's definitely like a learning process that's going on over the last several years, right? Because a lot of funders, I think even just 3, 4, 5 years ago were like, oh no, I don't want to fund local news. That's I want to fund services. I want to be providing meals to people. But I think there's just this gradual collective awareness that's building that supporting access to news and information is a worthy cause. Yeah.
So can I highlight something really quickly regarding that same topic, which is
Sure.
we saw something pretty incredible from the Dallas Morning News. They have what they call the Education Lab, and it is reader-supported, reader-funded reporting specifically for that topic of education. And that model has worked really well. All of our local newsrooms, despite being part of a larger network, are also seeking out that grant money, those additional funding sources to be able to do the big projects that we would like to do. So there's opportunities out there to do it. It's just a matter also of access and collaboration.
I also just wanted to add to that there is some research out there on the economic benefits of places that do have strong local news coverage, and in the absence of that, how those economic benefits don't exist, or say insurance prices are higher in places that don't have a community newspaper and that kind of thing. My gut instinct, of course, is that there are much bigger economic benefits than we even realize. I think there needs to be a lot more research on that, whether we're talking about at a local, community level, state level, nationally, and even globally. Because if you look internationally, stable economies and, well, places with a strong journalism basis have much more stable economies and stable governments. And that is critical to business and corporations that, around the world, wherever we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, and there's a related question here from Mark Glazer, who says, if Congress passes a new law to support local news around the country, let's hope Congress can pass things. Where do you think those funds should be directed? To legacy media, nonprofit media, startups, a combination of those outlets? If we're looking at unlocking a big, a different set of dollars to support local journalism, I guess, how do we spend that, or where does that money best go? And Jessica, let me start with you on that one.
I think it's going to take a much more than a big influx of money to fix the problems that we've accumulated in the journalism industry over the last couple of years. My first instinct is to say that there are things that are working now which do need support. Collaborative projects, for example, we've had huge success with that, working across neighboring newsrooms and medias, radio, online, virtual and physical newsrooms, print editions. to get that important reporting out. So my first instinct would be to say that there is ways to invest in those type of experiments, which might benefit local news much more than just trying to put that money into hiring new bodies or building out newsrooms.
Well, let's step away from the funding issue for now. We're not going to solve it. There's so many aspects to it, and it's really complicated. And I certainly hope that we continue to find great innovation around funding for local journalism, because obviously that's paramount to its success. Let's look ahead a little bit. We're about to celebrate our 1-year marker of staying at home during the pandemic. How has this affected journalism in terms of, journalists getting together and talking about stories in a newsroom, now doing it from a distance? Where do we go from here? What does local journalism look like in the face of, this amazing new world we're in, and, cost savings that can happen by having, offices closed? And Jessica, you and I talked about this before the program, so I'm going to pitch it right back at you.
Sure. One of the things that I was really grateful for was that we had already started moving into a virtual area for work, just it's out of necessity for the regions that I cover. So we were all pretty familiar with having a meeting online, every now and then. When COVID hit, when the pandemic came, that just transferred into a larger part of our daily workload. And I think we're all pretty comfortable with it. I know we were talking about how we've all picked up tips and tricks to make it kind of easier, how some of this stuff is more efficient. What we found for local reporters is that while it might be a little more efficient to produce and disseminate information, it makes it a little more difficult to really make those connections needed with our sources, with our communities, to tell those stories. So we started diving into how to get them back into reporting mode, being there in person and covering items, but also keeping them safe, right? Making sure that they're socially distanced, that they're being tested as needed for the virus, and that they're also complying with state laws, which was a huge thing for us. And we got back into a little bit of a groove where we talk about now, what does your day look like? Are you going to go out into the community? Are you going to work from your desk at home? Are you going to file from there? I found that my reporters are comfortable being, in a hybrid mode, a hybrid model of all of that. But looking forward, we do anticipate that we will probably continue to do a lot of our work virtually. We will continue to do a lot of our reporting virtually, making those connections online via Zoom meetings like this, and being able to make those connections that way. And you had alluded to something that we were talking about earlier, which is our companies my company specifically is looking for that cost savings. And one of those measures is moving away from the real estate business and trying to reinvest into our direct newsrooms. So divesting ourselves of like a physical location for the advantage of being able to be a little bit more mobile with our reporting. So we are doing that in hopes of having a bit of a cost savings. And I think that our reporters found that they can work just as well within the virtual sphere as they would in the physical.
Super. Well, we're running out of time, but I want to ask each of you the same question. And Karen, I'm going to start with you. When it comes to local journalism and democracy, when you look forward, what's one thing that gives you some optimism or some hope, in this very complicated landscape?
And this touches on the previous question. One of the positive things that I've seen come out of the past year is that people around the world, journalists and citizens, can be and are more connected in ways that people just weren't doing before, because anybody can get on a Zoom conversation like this anywhere in the world at any point, whereas in the past, in-person meetings excluded the rest of the world. So I'm optimistic about the fact that maybe beyond this, we will continue to all come together in more global ways and local ways that we just didn't before.
Rashad, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if like in 20 or 30 years, if we're looking back at this era, I think what we're going to say is that there was a period of like societal learning that we had to go through to like cope with the advent of social media. And that I think I'm optimistic that we're going to find a better balance than where we're at right now over time. And I just think that, it's just this flourishing of new communication methods, and that people just have to take time to like develop the social norms around evaluating information for truth, and just, our habits, like I personally sometimes get a little carried away with like doom scrolling on social media and things like that, right? And I think I'm optimistic that as a civilization, as a species, we're going to get this figured out. It's just going to be like a little sort of a rough period of adjustment, a little bit.
And Jessica, the last word goes to you.
So conversations like this are what give me hope. I think that we have learned over the last year how important having conversations about our challenges and our successes are. And taking that long view back, right, in 20 years or so, we're going to be talking about how there was a renewed interest in how we're doing journalism, and its effects on our democracy, and really how important it is to support that work.
Well put. And let me say a great dose of good luck to all of you in this, incredibly important field. Let me thank Jessica Ansarez, Karen Coates, Rashad Mahmood. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your thoughts on this core topic today.
Thank you so much for hosting us, Sandy. This was really great.
Yes,
Great.
thank you so much.
Great to be here.
Great. Well, thank you for coming. And folks, I look forward to seeing you next week when we get into some pandemic issues with the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News and Adrian Wooldridge from The Economist. Lots of exciting things in terms of journalism coming up. And until then, we will see you next time. Bye-bye, everyone.